everybody. Welcome back to another wonderful biology class. Today we're going to be looking at the building blocks of life. And the big focus question for today is why is carbon so essential for life? It's a good question. Let's get into it. Vocabulary we need for today are macromolecule, polymer, carbohydrate, lipids, proteins, amino acids, nucleic acids, and nucleotides. All great vocabulary. And the review vocabulary is something that, I don't know, you've probably never heard of as a freshman here. It's an organic compound, and an organic compound is generally a carbon-containing or carbon-based molecule of some kind. And we're going to get into this in a little more detail right now because organic chemistry is the study of carbon-containing compounds, and for a very long time it was actually separated very distinctly from inorganic chemistry, which was the study of non-living chemistry, and organic chemistry, which was reserved to the study of living chemistry. It was chemistry that seemed to happen only in living things. Now, in the last 100 years or so, we've actually been able to break that boundary. We can make carbohydrates, we can make carbon-containing compounds without too much of a problem. But for a very long time, there was the chemistry of life, which was organic, and then there was the chemistry of non-life, which was inorganic. That has now changed a little bit, and it's the chemistry of carbon-containing mostly versus non-carbon-containing. Now, macromolecules are a broad class of molecules that exist within living systems that are quite large. And generally speaking, they are polymers, meaning that they have small units called monomers that chemically bind together through what's known as dehydration synthesis. You don't really care because this is an AP, but that's the process that they bind together with. Pardon me. And your monomers become polymers. And those polymers make up your macromolecules. And there are four big classes of macromolecules. There are carbohydrates, there are lipids, there are proteins, and there are nucleic acids. Those are the four big classes of macromolecules, and they would all, generally speaking, qualify as polymers because each one of them is made up of units that can be thought of as monomers. Now, the first class is carbohydrates, and its general piece of its monomer, so the smallest unit of a carbohydrate, is one carbon and two hydrogens, okay? And those generally link up to make 4, 5, or 6 carbon sugars. You can have fewer, organic molecules, but the stable sugars that exist to create other things, bigger units, tend to have 5 or 6 carbons in them, and sometimes 4. And so the general chemical unit is going to be CH2O with an oxygen. So you have equal numbers of carbons and oxygens in the monomers of your sugars with twice as many hydrogens. And so a good kind of example carbohydrate is glucose, which is C6H12O6. We looked at that in a chemical equation in the last lecture, I believe. Maybe it was the one before that, chemical reactions. It's been a while, but either way, that's a good example of a monomer. And two glucose can link together through dehydration synthesis to become a dimer. And then many of them can link together to form a polymer. And those are polymers of carbohydrates. Or that polymer would be a carbohydrate. So a single sugar is called a saccharide. This isn't super important for you to know, but that's the proper name for, say, one glucose molecule is a monosaccharide. And two monosaccharides link together to become a disaccharide. And then three become a polysaccharide. Okay. And polysaccharides can be used for both energy storage and structural support. So, um, cellulose, the cell wall of plants that makes the woody portion of plants, is essentially a carbohydrate. It's a polysaccharide. The fats that are stored in your body are polysaccharides. Okay. So that's energy storage versus physical structural support. So the two main functions of your carbohydrates are energy storage and structural support. Now, lipids, on the other hand, um, are multi component. They usually have what's called a glycerol backbone, and then they have 2 to 3 fatty acid tails, depending on what type of lipid it is, and they can function as hormones in a different type of lipid. So, lipids can function as hormones, they can function as phospholipids, which are barriers between the inside and the outside of a cell. Um, they can function as hormones, and they can also function as energy storage as well in a triglyceride. So, variety of functions, very useful stuff. And lipids most commonly are thought of as those structures which separate the inside of a cell from the outside of a cell, and that's your phospholipid bilayer, which we'll talk about a whole lot more in the next chapter, I believe. Now, proteins have amino acids as their monomers, and they link together through carboxylic bonding. So they have a carboxyl group and an amine group, and they form peptide bonds, polypeptide bonds. And again, dehydration synthesis to create long chains of amino acids. And depending on which of the 20 amino acids are linked together, they fold to create a protein. Okay? And we'll talk about these in a little more detail, I guess, probably in one of my assignments in class. But the general idea here is pretty well the same. Proteins have monomers. Depending on which monomers are put in there, you get a different macromolecule, a different protein. And multiple proteins can come together to create a larger protein. And so they have different levels of structure. And so your primary structure, just go ahead through the 4 levels here, is the sequence of your amino acids. So which ones are actually bonded together. Secondary structure is going to be either an alpha helices or a beta pleated sheet. This is just the way they tend to fold in the cell environment. Tertiary structure is where you have an actual functional protein, in many cases, a single globular protein. And then quaternary structure happens when you have multiple proteins come together to create a protein superstructure. Now, protein structure and protein function are directly related to which of the 20 amino acids are put in what sequence. Okay, and so they can be used for things like transportation, they can be used for structural support, they can be used as enzymes to catalyze reactions, so they're essential in cell growth. Proteins are basically all of the machinery of the cell that allow cells to do what they do. Without proteins, there would be no mechanical component to cells, and there'd be no life. And without enzymes, the activation energy would be way too high for chemical reactions to occur. There'd be no life. So, yes, proteins are one of those very essential components for living systems. Oh, sorry, I guess I jumped the shark here again. The book does list the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures of proteins. Again, depending on which amino acids are present, that determines your primary structure. That primary structure determines how it will fold into its secondary structure. Multiple secondary structures will determine how it folds into a tertiary structure. And then finally, multiple tertiary proteins combine to form a quaternary structure. All right, nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are a bit different than all of the other types of macromolecules because their function is primarily information storage and transfer in DNA and RNA. There are some RNA zymes that can catalyze chemical reactions, but we're not really going to get into those in this class. And so DNA can be thought of as long term computer storage, like your hard drive, and RNA can be thought of as a short term transfer memory, kind of like RAM in a computer. And these two molecules are made up of nucleotides. These nucleic acids are made up of single nucleotides that come in 5 varieties. In DNA, it's adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. In RNA, it's uracil, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So, and adenine. The T, thymine, gets replaced with U, uracil, in RNA. So that's what you're looking at in nucleic acids, and its primary structure is, our primary function is going to be information storage. Consequently, your DNA is found almost exclusively in the nucleus, though you do get a little bit in chloroplasts and mitochondria, and we might talk about that a little bit later. And RNA can be found in the nucleus, close to the nucleus, or near ribosomes, which we will talk about later this chapter, or later in this unit. So, all right, moving on and going back to our original focus question, why is carbon essential for life? Hopefully looking at those macromolecules and what they're made of will give you a hint on how to answer this question. Of course, if you have more questions, there's a lot more here to look into and learn. I'm happy to answer questions. I love questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening.